Ladies and gentlemen, in the months that followed 9/11, the then Attorney General asked me to chair a commission looking at vulnerability to terrorist threats of infrastructure in the state. And to do that, he loaned me the Deputy Attorney General, whose name was Michael McCaul in the process. So that's where we began working together on these issues. And we've had the privilege of doing that along the way. I began maybe with a little more knowledge from my background. And steadily, as he moved up in the Homeland Security Committee to become its chair, he got more and more briefings and became more and more knowledgeable. So I'm the one now follows behind to keep up. But it's a great pleasure to introduce to you all Chairman Michael McCaul.
My thanks to the Admiral. He has been a mentor. I think I've been a good student. I've tried to be on most issues, and really has taught me. I remember when I first got elected, he actually encouraged me to join this new committee called the Homeland Security Committee in the wake of 9/11. And little did I know I'd become the chairman of that committee, leapfrogging the seniority, which is rarely done in Washington. And it's become a passion of mine, and there's no shortage of issues currently to talk about. I wouldn't correlate my becoming chairman with the chaos we're seeing right now across the world, but it is a very serious, a lot of serious issues out there. I also want to thank my wife, Linda, for showing up. And she was with Naval Intelligence, and of course, Admiral Inman was the director of Naval Intelligence. And when I first met her at the Air and Space Museum, I was working at Justice Department, and I said, "What are you doing up here?" And she said, "Well, I work for Naval Intelligence." I said, "Well, what do you do for them?" She goes, "Well, I track Soviet submarines." I said, "Well, I've never dated somebody that tracks Soviet submarines. Would you like to go out with me?" And I always say she's been tracking me ever since. But the start of a great relationship and 5 teenagers we have at home. And she doesn't like me saying this, but I say I have some personal experience with domestic terrorism with them. But it's been a great journey, and I'm just the issues of the day just couldn't be more relevant. Of course, Mali just got an Al-Qaeda attack today. We're seeing an unbelievable, what is now a competition between ISIS and Al-Qaeda, which is a very dangerous competition for the United States and particularly Europe. I had the great honor to go last May. I went to Israel to meet with Prime Minister Netanyahu, went into Baghdad, met with the Prime Minister there a week before Ramadi fell, then to Istanbul, the airport where the foreign fighters go through to get into Syria, and then we met with French counterterrorism officials and Belgium. We produced a task force report. I encourage all of you to go on the Homeland Security Committee's website. It's available. And what we did was, that was in September, after a 6-month investigation, produced a product that focused on the threat of foreign fighters, 5,000 from Europe with Western passports and visa waiver countries, and hundreds of Americans who have traveled to the region to train in the art of warfare and terrorism. Paris was a foreign fighter attack. This report, in some respects, seems somewhat prescient, given the fact it wasn't an after-action report, but rather a report that was done prior to the Paris attack. That was a very sophisticated, highly coordinated attack that was unfortunately successful. And what we're seeing with ISIS now is what we expected from Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, that is bombs on airplanes. So we had the downing of the Russian airliner, which I thought initially had all the hallmarks of AQAP, but now we're seeing ISIS get into the game of conducting external operations. This is a new evolving threat, a new chapter for ISIS, where they are now not just looking at concentrating on what they call the Caliphate and the Islamic State, but rather what external operations can they conduct to hit the West and, quite frankly, Russia. Now that Russia's in Syria, completely complicates the military objective. You have a Russian, Syrian, Iranian alliance, a Shia alliance, versus a Sunni threat of extremism, as well. So we had the external plot on the Russian airliner that was successful. It could have been a United States-bound flight. And then we had the external plot in Lebanon, killing over 40 people, a suicide bomber, and then the highly sophisticated Paris attack that has led counterterrorism officials not only to make arrests in Paris, but also in Belgium, where we just were last May. When I was there at that time, they were very concerned about the sort of infiltration, if you will, of potential ISIS followers. Suicide vests, the way they communicate. People ask me, why was Paris under the radar screen? Well, it's because they have learned from Mr. Snowden, who's done so much damage to our national security, how to communicate in what's called dark space and dark platforms. And this means that even if we have a court order, a Title III wiretap, or a FISA, we can't see these communications because they're on platforms designed to be encrypted from end to end. So we may see someone from Raqqa talking to someone. We know they're communicating with somebody in Paris or Belgium or in New York, but we can't see what the communications are. And it's hard to stop a threat that you can't see in advance. I just got off the phone with the New York Police Department, with John Miller, the commissioner, the vice commissioner, and the counterterrorism guy that heads up their counterterrorism operations. They are on high alert. They have a strong visibility in the streets for deterrence, but they're very concerned about this dark space communication issue as well. And people say, well, that's all, the threat's all over there, so we shouldn't really have to worry about it. But the fact of the matter is, in the homeland, we have made over 70 ISIS-related arrests over the past year. That's more than one per week that we have been able to stop. There are over 900, almost now 1,000 investigations in the United States, in all 50 states, that are ISIS-related. This is of concern to me because you don't know where it's going to come from next. And people say it's one case you didn't know about. I think the Chattanooga case was a prime example of a case that we just didn't have the flags and the warning signs in advance to stop. And now there are 4 Marines who are dead and 1 sailor because we couldn't see it coming in advance. So when I talked to the FBI director after that happened, we said this was a case we were concerned about. I don't know how many more of those can happen. We stopped a lot of bad things from happening. The Garland attack, the 4th of July plot in New York, and many other cases as well. But it's hard to be right 100% of the time. And it's the old adage, they only have to be right once, and that could be a devastating. And as I see the capability of ISIS going beyond just, we easily saw them as a bottom-up organization, not directed out of Raqqa, but just internet directives to just do whatever you can. Attack military. That's what they constantly attack, military installations, military. So we saw, you see random radicalization cases on the internet of, the guy in New York with an axe trying to kill a police officer, 1 to 2 man operations. What concerns me about Paris is the numbers of foreign fighters involved and the level of sophistication that they had in perpetrating one of the most horrific acts since World War II. And ironically, the president called it, said that ISIS has been contained on that very same day. I would argue that they are not. I would argue the policy shouldn't be a policy of containment either. It should be a policy to defeat and destroy them. Otherwise, we're going to continue to have external plots and operations that could take place in the United States. And we're going to continue to have this refugee problem. That was a hot issue. I just flew back from Washington last night. Our bill that I introduced was to put a pause button on the Syrian refugee program until we can get further assurances from the FBI that they can do background checks and properly vet these individuals before we bring them in the United States. And then we required a certification from the DNI and from the FBI and the Secretary of Homeland that they do not present a national security risk to the United States. Why did we do this? We did this, it wasn't a figment of my imagination. It was based upon briefings both privately and publicly in testimony before my committee that we don't have the databases, we don't have the intelligence to properly vet these individuals. And that was coming from both the FBI and from Homeland Security officials. And I must say, once my colleagues on the other side of the aisle actually read the 4-page bill, it was very simple, and it just calls for increased vetting, a robust vetting and process before we bring them in. We're a humanitarian, compassionate nation, but if we're going to do this from the capital where ISIS exists, with this population in Iraq and Syria where they exist, I think we have to be smart about what we're doing, because the last thing we want to do is bring in somebody who could be a threat to Americans here. We know that one of the Paris attackers used the refugee process to get in, and ISIS, in their own words, has said, we want to exploit the refugee program to infiltrate the West. Their words, not mine. I have to take them seriously when they say things like that and do everything I can to protect Americans from a terrorist attack. I can tell you these foreign fighters, though, is the one threat, and we want to keep them when they come back. If they come back, we obviously want to detain and arrest. We've stopped a lot of them from either traveling or from trying to get back in, but there are some here that we are continuing to monitor for that threat. The other threat, the dual threat, is a foreign fighter. The other one is radicalization over the internet. There are 200,000 ISIS tweets per day. And so when I sit down with Homeland and FBI, how do you manage that amount of volume of traffic on the internet? And then when you look at these, what we call, for lack of a better term, these ISIS cyber commanders who are very good at sending out, again, the dark space communications. Once they've radicalized somebody, they tell them to go into the dark platform. And from there, they can send communications, and we just can't see what they're saying. We think Chattanooga was one of those cases. So that's the other threat, is the radicalization of somebody already in the United States who doesn't have to even travel to the region, but rather can join the cause. NYPD call them losers to lions. They're looking for something greater than themselves, essentially. And they hit the sort of military age male who's disaffected, looking for something, a purpose. And this, quite frankly, one of the bills we're going to be looking at came out of my committee, is combating violent extremism from within. We need better outreach to the Muslim community, not just by the FBI or a federal prosecutor like me, but rather by organizations that can do community outreach to the effective communities where radicalization is most likely to take place. The Boston bomber had radicalized so much in his mosque that he was actually kicked out for being too extreme, but we didn't know that. That was not reported to authorities. And so we want, better reporting when people see signs of radicalization from within the United States. So to close, I'd like to have more of a discussion, but we need to do a couple things well. And in our task force report, we do make these legislative recommendations that the Speaker is very interested in moving forward with, including some tightening up visa waiver countries to at least have them check with Interpol before they bring people in. I was shocked that looking at the Istanbul airport, prior to a year ago, there was no really screening of any people coming in because they were going to fight Assad, and that's all they didn't care. But now that they're hitting people and killing people in Turkey, they actually start screening them in. But their outbound travel, not a whole lot of screening. And if you're an EU citizen, because of their privacy concerns, these travelers are not even vetted past a watch list. So France understands the threat. They are moving with Belgium, I think, and the UK to get the European Parliament to change that restriction where at least people are vetted before they fly in airplanes from Istanbul and other places into Europe. I would argue Europe is far more wide open to the threat, not only because of the proximity, but because of the ease of travel in the Schengen province and the lack of any travel restrictions that we have in this country. So the military strategy is paramount. I would argue that it hasn't been effective. The strikes are starting to ramp up now. The rules of engagement, 75% of our sorties come back without delivering their capability. I think that hurts us. And just having an overall strategy and a political solution to the civil war conflict in Syria. And then how do you deal with Assad, particularly now? He was a magnet for the jihadists. And how do you deal with him when the Russians now are in there protecting him and propping him up? And most of their airstrikes, target packages I've seen, are really to prop up the regime rather than go after ISIS. Now, I would argue, and the Admiral and I agree, that I think because with the Russian airliner and the homeland security issues that Russia will now have because they're in the region, I hope that they will start turning their sights on ISIS as well. I don't have any great optimism we could do a joint military strategy with them, but I do think that it's possible we could do a coordinated strategy where they take their targets and we take ours. The ground force is kind of the key issue here. Where do you get your ground force? Well, the Kurds, Peshmerga, are pretty good at fighting. They're primarily concerned about taking back Iraq and Mosul. They've taken back some cities already. Mosul is going to be the next big fight. But in Syria itself, where do you get the ground force? What we want, ideally, is an indigenous Sunni Arab population fighting the Sunni extremists. You know, the Gulf states that have helped finance a lot of this, in our judgment, need to step up to the plate and provide the Sunni Arab ground force to clean up their own backyard and clean up their own religion. I don't think a lot of people are very sanguine about putting 100,000 U.S. combat troops in there. That will provoke more of this retaliation. But I do think we need our special forces in there embedded. We need U.S. leadership and the coalition working together to defeat ISIS. This can be done, but we need the political will to do it. And then we have to deal with the political realities of Assad and a civil war that if we don't remedy that, we're going to continue to have these problems. And then finally, I don't know. I mean, I put a lot of pressure on the Gulf states, and I had a hearing on Syria with Foreign Affairs Committee, a lot of pressure for the Gulf states to take these refugees as well. They are Sunni Arabs. A refugee, by definition, wants to go back to their home when the conflict's over. And the Gulf states are, I think, in the ideal position to take care of a Sunni Arab population fleeing Assad, and they certainly have the wherewithal to do it. But unfortunately, they are not. They haven't taken one refugee. So I guess, in conclusion, it's a very complicated Sunni-Shia conflict. There's no easy solution. I think our ability to not just make decisions, and inaction is a decision, but our inaction has now greatly complicated the matter. And now with the Russians in there, there's no easy solution to this. But we have to find a solution long term, or we're going to continue to have these threats come out of there. We're also seeing it in northern Africa. And at the end of the day, it's a war of ideology. And how do you defeat an ideology? We can kill with drone strikes, and we do. We killed, obviously, the mastermind of the Paris attack, Junaid Hussein, who was their internet commander. We killed in a drone strike. But drone strikes alone cannot kill an ideology. So this is a long-term struggle, in my opinion, that we will be dealing with for a generation in winning the war of ideas. I'm hopeful at the end of the day that we do. I think our ideas are better. They are very primitive, almost 6th century AD force that are going back in time to a very primitive way of thinking and a very barbaric and brutal life. And so I think we prevail at the end, but it will take time. And so with that, I just want to thank everyone for participating. I want to thank the Admiral for his great friendship over the years and his mentorship. And I know there's a lot of talent in the room, but also people who have spoken to you previously, about these issues. I haven't even talked about cybersecurity, but we can talk about that as well. Just very briefly on that point, I did pass a major piece of cybersecurity legislation, information sharing bill that will allow the federal government to share malicious code threat information with the private sector backed with the federal government, with liability protection, which is important. We think that this has great potential to help harden our network defenses in light of the OPM breach, stealing 20 million security clearances from China, one of the biggest acts of espionage and big data theft, to the Russian organized criminal Target Home Depot attack, to North Korea on Sony, to basically crushing and bringing down Sony because of freedom of speech issues, to Iran's attack on the financial sector, which happens almost on a daily basis, and then finally the cyber jihadists that would like to bring things down, but they don't have quite the capability yet. The Senate finally acted on this, and this could be one of the few really important national security pieces of legislation that and I've been working with the White House on this. Don't always work with them on everything, but this one is where we're actually all, I think, on the same page, and I'm hopeful that we'll actually get something done up there, which is what the American people, I think, really want us to do. So with that, thanks for having me, and I appreciate your attendance. Yes, sir. Admiral.
As you deal with the Arab world, thank you. As you deal with, in your travels, the leaders of Arab countries, do you get any sense of their trying to work on their religious leaders to condemn this long string of violence being done in the name of religion?
Yes, the top imams, they don't condone this violence, nor do they condone the perversion of their faith. I do think it's incumbent upon them to clean up their own backyard and their own religion. But at the same time, what happened, as you know, Admiral, in Syria was the funding of the rebel forces that, indiscriminately, that actually went to the formation of ISIS. And I do think their religion, and they're in the best position to basically call it out. I mean, we can call it out in the United States, but that only inflames it. I think if their religious leaders call it out, then that's a far better, approach. But, people ask, how did ISIS how did it even come about in the first place? As the Admiral knows, they released these guys, AQI. So what we had Taya Chris Kyle's wife, at an event for children of military kids at our house, and he was, American Sniper, was fighting Al-Qaeda in Iraq. This is a mutation of that. It's still the Baathists, military commanders, leaders, but it's also all these foreign fighters from 100 different countries now poured into this fight against Assad. And so when they were released from the prison, al-Baghdadi, the leader, basically said, I'll see you in New York, is what he said, which is a little frightening. And now this has grown into a governing state, if you will. It's very hard to stop. There's been talk in the Congress about an authorized use of military force or declaration of war against ISIS. There's some pros and cons of both of those. I do think the president has the inherent authority under the 2001 because ISIS is really, it's an offshoot of Al-Qaeda, even though they're competing with each other. But I'm one of the ones that I think Congress should be doing something along those lines. When I talk to the Turkish ambassador and Jordanian, they tell me that we'll put the ground force in tomorrow if you would, number one, have a strategy, and number two, you have to get Assad out of there. Because as long as Assad is there, they won't do anything that will empower or embolden Assad. From their point of view, Assad is sort of their antichrist. He is the Shia in power. That's the reason why those rebel forces are there. And I think a lot of this funding, particularly out of Qatar and Kuwait, a lot of this funding actually spilled over to actually fund ISIS itself. I think the lack of a status of forces agreement, like what we had after World War II, not having any residual force in Iraq, and the complete political neglect of Prime Minister Maliki, those two things combined imploded Iraq, and then out of it, ISIS raised its ugly head. And we haven't had a strategy, I think, that has been very effective in dealing with it. And I think Paris is a wake-up call that we need to, and I think the Europeans are going to be more engaged in this fight as well. Yeah.
If I can follow up on a couple things you mentioned earlier, you alluded to the concerns about homegrown domestic radicalization, and then in response to the Admiral, you mentioned the common roots that ISIS had coming out of AQI, but then now the competition between the groups. So when you look at the domestic radicalization threat here in the U.S., do you see it primarily from ISIS or from Al-Qaeda? Like, Americans were concerned about radicalizing. Which one are they listening to more?
ISIS. I mean, ISIS is the winning game in town. ISIS is the one that has the propaganda videos, the 200,000 tweets a day. ISIS is the one sending directives out of Raqqa into the United States every day in communication platforms that are SecureCom that we can't see. It's the target here in the United States is a more disaffected military-age male that, again, when I talk to NYPD, and they deal with this a lot, is the loser to lion concept of somebody that they can get a hook on and then do this radicalization. What I fear more, even though that's very prevalent and pervasive and hard to stop, I fear more the coordinated attack like Paris that would be more of a foreign fighter type person trained. But no question that ISIS is winning, and Al-Qaeda is sort of viewed in this competition as losing. If you were in the boardroom of Al-Qaeda, you'd say, why aren't we more like ISIS, right? But they've also condemned ISIS for being too brutal in their tactics, which is amazing for Al-Qaeda to say that. It must be bad. But they are very effective in their propaganda. I'll tell you the one other thing is that al-Awlaki is still, his sermons are still some of the most, in terms of watched videos, he's been killed years ago by an airstrike, but his sermons are still very influential in the radicalization process, which is amazing. But he was very talented and gifted at delivering this propaganda in a way that was credible, for someone who was vulnerable to that kind of message. But how do you stop there's a homegrown lone wolf type, and then there's the foreign fighter type that's going to have a more coordinated, sophisticated attack. Either one can do a lot of damage. Yeah.
Sir, you made a reference earlier to the going dark problem. End-to-end encryption, we can't monitor their communications even with a warrant. The FBI Director Comey has talked about how Apple and Google switching to default end-to-end encryption on their more recent devices really makes this a conscious choice the companies are making. And more recently than that, the White House has said that they're not going to pursue a legislative solution to this that might mandate the companies create some kind of way for properly warranted surveillance to take place. Do you think in the wake of either after Paris or after something that may happen down the road, we're going to see some legislation on that nonetheless?
Yes. However, we have to be very careful. So there's a statute, it's called CALEA, but we could amend that statute to include smartphones. The problem with that is you're going to put a back door into the iPhone, for instance. And the political backlash will be, this is one of those cases where my teenagers will be calling me saying, Daddy, what are you doing? You're putting a backdoor and the government, can get into my, so there's going to be that privacy. It's all encrypted for privacy reasons because you may have healthcare, financial stuff on your iPhone with apps. And so I actually was at Apple, they have 5,000, second largest presence is here in Austin, and talked to them about this very issue. There's a court case right now where they want them to open up the contents of the phone and deliver the communications, and Apple's saying, we can't do it. We don't have the technology because it's not designed that way. So what we are trying to do, and I've talked to Comey, and he's testified extensively before my committee on it, as well as Jay Johnson, is try to find, if we can, a technology solution to this. But I think in the wake of Paris, it's more of a, and the more attacks we see, by the way, I think there are other plots, in my judgment, underway in Europe that we think are going on, but we can't see communications. I think it's going to be a bigger and bigger issue. But I think the technology solution is kind of the key. I had lunch with Keith Alexander, Admiral's NSA director, and no one, the Admiral and Keith are probably the two most brilliant people on this issue. And even he tells you there's really no easy technology solution to this unless you have a public and private key to open it up. Now, that's something we can mandate, but there'll be a lot of blowback from the technology companies. They don't want an opening either so that the hackers can get in. I mean, there's a real issue about backdoor hackers getting in. So our recommendations on the task force, I think the legislation you're going to see after Thanksgiving is to, and I hate to punt this to a commission, but this is one of those things where I think it really is warranted, is to by legislation, form a commission of former NSA directors and current federal law enforcement and Silicon Valley and the tech companies and say, you know what, this is your mission. You have to provide a solution and make recommendations to Congress on legislative solutions or technology if you can come up with that without passing a law. We got to be careful. There are unintended consequences to the simple answer is just to amend the CLIA statute, but that's going to be fraught with a lot of
Following
peril.
up, if I may, on this exact topic, a lot of the companies went to the encryption path after Snowden because they were afraid they were going to lose business in Europe.
Exactly.
Now what's happening, what do you hear coming out of France and the other countries? Have they changed their view about the need to have access as opposed to privacy being the overriding issue?
Well, and that's a great question. And Snowden did, this evolved out of Snowden. And they're built with, that's how they market and sell, is that, you have total privacy protection and encryption, which a lot of people, consumers like that, but in the law enforcement context, it's a counterterrorism, it's a nightmare. I do think that France and Belgium, even when I was there after Charlie Hebdo, even before Paris, we're starting to move more towards the security side. Europe has very much, the privacy issue is very strong in Europe. You're right, international businessmen, if there's any, like when we were doing our cyber bill, we didn't want it to be a surveillance bill. It's not, it's an information sharing. And it had to be the civilian portal, not NSA, because if they think the NSA is in our networks, any international businessman like Dell, for instance, is going to get killed in the international market. So in Germany, it's a very privacy, because they've lived under, fascism and communism. It's ingrained in their culture. But I think in light of some of these attacks, you're seeing, there's always privacy and security, and it swings depending on the events of the day. And I do think the Brits, the French, and the Belgium are now starting to tilt more towards the security side, as they should. And now they're trying to deal with this 500,000 refugees have poured into Europe. And unlike our country, they have no vetting. I mean, they're crossing by land coming in, and then they go, and unlike in the United States, they're not assimilated. They're not integrated in society. They're very polar. I mean, they're not, they have their own communities, and that can breed radicalization as well. I think Europe's going to have a very difficult problem on its hand for a while. Yeah, we got a lot of hands. You want to moderate?
Yes, Congressman. This really isn't meant to be a hostile question, but last time I checked,
I can handle it.
well, the last time I checked, no, I'm really not trying to be hostile, but the last time I checked, it was the coalition that invaded Iraq 12 and a half years ago. And I mean, couldn't you argue, I would argue, without the invasion of Iraq, well, first of all, there wouldn't be a refugee crisis today. There wouldn't really be a Syrian civil war. There may not have even been an Arab Spring, or if there was an Arab Spring, it would be a very different Arab Spring. So I guess when you invade other countries and when currently we're supporting the enemies of ISIS now, doesn't that leave us wide open to essentially what happened in Paris? And I mean, why is it a surprise when, I mean, Colin Powell said it, when you break it, you buy it. I mean, we're buying it, and we have been for 12 and a half years. I don't understand.
And certainly, I mean, point well taken. I mean, anytime you put your finger over there, there's a ripple effect. And it's a very dangerous part of the world. And, going back to the Mujahideen and the fight against the Soviets, I mean, Admiral knows. We armed them, and that kind of blew back on us. There's a blowback effect to everything we do over there. So we got to be very, very careful. That's why I go back to the policy of the indigenous Sunni Arab force rather than, I've seen our guys over there. I've been to Iraq and Afghanistan a lot, and Pakistan, and our presence provokes some of this. I mean, they look at our guys, and we're the infidel on Muslim ground. And so we have to be very careful with that. I was elected after the decision to invade Iraq was made. At that point, my concern was just stabilizing it to the point where we could, get our guys out of there. But the residual force, I think, should have been in place. I don't know about Syria. I think as long as Assad was there, you're going to have this jihadist magnet that he's driving in. Bottom line is it's a Sunni-Shia conflict over there. And we got to be very careful about getting in the middle of all that, right? And I think what we do does have an impact. General Wald, who led the Tora Bora invasion, said if I just had 1,500 more guys, I think we could have taken out bin Laden, and that would have changed history. I think if we had killed bin Laden in those early days, it would have been a totally different, we would have been praised around the world. I don't know if Iraq even would have happened at that point. And it has created problems. Now, I'm not going to say it hasn't. Oh, there's so many.
Congressman, over here.
Yeah.
Heads up. Yes. You are calling, or the United States seems to be insistent on a policy of removal of Assad from Syria, and you are saying that the jihadists are coming to Syria to fight for Assad.
Fight against Assad.
Fight against Assad.
No.
Good. I'm glad you're clear on that.
They don't like it.
I haven't heard a single explanation, one ever in the going on 5 years, as to why Bashar al-Assad is a sufficient obstacle, enemy, nuisance, threat, whatever, to the United States as to warrant removal and warrant United States actions against him. He's the leading fighter against ISIS, ISIL. Why are we still insisting on his removal? And isn't the smarter thing to do to abandon our anti-Assad policy that nobody can put an explanation to anyway?
Good question. Unlike this Arab Spring thing turned into a winter and turned a bunch of power vacuums out there that have been filled by the more radical movement. We took Mubarak out of Egypt, and look what we got there. We got the Muslim Brotherhood taking over. Then we had Gaddafi in Libya. As bad as he was, he came around, took him out. Look what we got in Libya. I'm all for stability in the region, which is how we left Iraq, and then we sort of ignored it, and I think that was part of the problem with Iraq. But Assad is a magnet for them. But I would also argue that Assad's he's not the one that's going to light up the streets of New York. It's ISIS. Now, the Russians have come in, and actually their target packages have hit the anti-Assad forces. These are the more moderate rebel forces that would be fighting ISIS. So now and our CIA is on the ground with them, and now the Russians are killing, the very ground force that could go against ISIS, and some of our guys in the process. So we're trying to deconflict with the Russians. It underscores the complexity of this issue. But I'll tell you this. The Russians, they want stability too. That's the one thing we have in common. They have called upon a Vienna Convention to form a new constitution in Syria without Assad being a part of that process. I would argue that they are not wedded to him, that they want stability for a lot of strategic reasons, not to mention energy, the oil fields in Syria to the ports in the Mediterranean. So they want stability too. And there's only one country that can produce a peaceful, graceful exile of him out of Syria, and that would be the Russians. Now, whether that happens, I don't know. But I do know as long as Assad is in there, he's going to continue to be a magnet for these jihadists, and you're going to continue to have this. I prefer to see him gracefully leave and have someone else put in power that's elected, which is where they're trying to go with this Vienna Convention, is have an election. And maybe, the Alawites have to be, it has to be partitioned. I don't know what the answer is, but it is one of the most complicated issues.
Congressman, anybody who's fighting ISIL is going to be a magnet for the anti-ISIL forces.
Right. So now they got the front. They got the European. They're picking fights with the Europeans, the Russians, and the United States. So they're going to have quite a fight on their hands.
I'm going to have to bring it to a close. Thank you so much
Thanks,
for
Admiral.
coming, considering our time. Always wonderful to see you.
Great seeing you too.
Thank you.
Thank you.